Qualifiers are used to adjust qualities of an object or a variable. There are two types of qualifiers in C++, CV qualifiers and storage qualifiers. This is an example of a variable declaration with qualifiers. In this example, the const and static keywords are qualifiers. They tell the compiler that this variable will be immutable, that's the const qualifier, and that it will have static storage duration. There are two types of qualifiers. CV stands for constant and volatile. So const marks the variable as read-only or immutable. Its value cannot be changed once it's been defined. And volatile marks a variable that may be changed by another process. This is generally used for threaded code or externally linked code. Mutable is used on a data member to make it writable from a const qualified member function. Storage duration specifiers are used to define the duration or lifetime of a variable. By default, a variable defined within a block has automatic lifetime. Lifetime is the duration of the block. There is no qualifier for this because it's the default. There used to be an auto qualifier, but it was rarely used, so the keyword has been repurposed. Variables declared as static have life beyond the execution of a block. Static variables live for the duration of the program. Static variables are commonly used for keeping state between instances of a given function or method. Static variables are stored globally, even if they are stored in a class. By default, a variable defined outside of any block is static. Register variables are stored in processor registers. This can make them faster and easier to access and operate on. This qualifier is taken as a suggestion by the compiler. The compiler may or may not actually store the variable in a register. Extern variables are defined in a separate translation unit and are linked with your code by the linker step of the compiler. Let's take a look at a couple of these in code. Here I have a working copy of qualifiers.cpp from chapter 5 of the exercise files. And you'll notice down here in main, we'll get to this other stuff in a minute, I have a simple integer that has a value of 42. Now, by default, this variable has automatic storage duration, and it's not marked as const, so it is volatile. So if I change it down here and say I equals 127, and then I build and run, you see that it says that the value is 127. If on the other hand, I put the word const in front of this, now if I try and build, you notice I get this error that says read-only variable is not assignable. And that's because I used the const keyword, which is a CV qualifier, which marks this variable as read-only or immutable. So I'm going to take that assignment away, and I will just go ahead and get rid of this as well. And instead here, I'm going to call our function. Now, inside of our function, you notice I have an integer, x, and I increment that integer. And so again, this defaults to auto and volatile. And so if I were to change this to const, of course, the plus plus x would give us that same error, read-only variable is not assignable. So if I build and run here, you see that our value is 8 because it's getting incremented before the value is returned. Now what's interesting here is if I go and call this several times, you see each time the value is 8. But if I change this to static duration, now when I build it, each time the value is going to increase because this now has static lifetime. It's declared and initialized once, and then each time the function is called, it gets incremented again. So you can see how the static duration could help you to keep state inside a function or a class. What's interesting is that static variables work exactly the same way inside of a class. You would think that the static variable would be encapsulated in the class like everything else is, but instead it's actually global. And so if I were to declare two objects based on our class S, and I'm going to call that static value method for both of them, and it does exactly the same thing. It simply increments this x. What's interesting is that we're going to get two different values. We're going to get an 8 and a 9 Because this is declared static, even though I have two instances of this object, it's the same instance of the static variable. There's only one of them, and it's stored globally. So be careful if you're declaring a static variable inside of a class, and be aware that there will only be one copy of it globally. Qualifiers are used to control the quality of variables. Some of these, like const and static, you will use frequently. Others are good to know about for when you need them or when you see them in code.